The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the road and reducing visibility to almost zero. The wind howled like a wounded animal, its icy claws scraping against the windows of the car. Inside, David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He had been driving for hours, navigating the treacherous mountain road with a mix of determination and dread. David was a man of routine, a creature of habit. He had taken this route countless times before, commuting between his small hometown and the city where he worked. But tonight was different. Tonight, the storm had turned the familiar road into a frozen labyrinth, each twist and turn more perilous than the last. His thoughts drifted to his wife, Sarah, and their young daughter, Emily. They were waiting for him at home, their faces lit by the warm glow of the fireplace. He could almost hear Emily's laughter, see Sarah's smile. He had promised them he'd be home for dinner, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Just as David rounded a sharp bend, his headlights caught something on the road ahead, a dark shape, barely visible through the swirling snow. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. His heart pounded as he squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a wolf. The animal stood in the middle of the road, its silver-gray fur dusted with snow, its piercing blue eyes fixed on David. Behind it, more wolves emerged from the shadows, their forms ghostly in the dim light. David's breath caught in his throat. Wolves were dangerous, unpredictable. He had heard the stories: hunters attacked, livestock killed, even the occasional hiker gone missing. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed for help. But there was no signal, just the cold, mocking silence of the storm. The wolves didn't move. They just stood there, their eyes locked on David, their breath visible in the freezing air. David's mind raced. Should he honk the horn, try to drive around them, or wait them out, hoping they'd lose interest and leave? He decided to wait. Turning off the engine, he sat in the silence. The only sound, the howling wind and the soft crunch of snow beneath the wolves' paws. Minutes passed, then hours. The wolves didn't budge. As the night wore on, David began to notice something strange. The wolves weren't acting aggressively. They weren't growling or baring their teeth. Instead, they seemed anxious. One of them, a large alpha male, kept glancing toward the side of the road, his ears twitching as if listening for something. Finally, David couldn't take it anymore. He stepped out of the car, his boots sinking into the snow. The wolves tensed, their eyes following his every move, but they didn't attack. "What do you want?" David shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. The alpha wolf let out a soft whine and took a few steps toward the side of the road. He stopped and looked back at David, his eyes filled with a quiet urgency. David hesitated, then followed. The wolf led him to a snowdrift, its nose nudging the ground insistently. David knelt, brushing away the snow with his gloved hands. Beneath the snow was a car, half buried and barely visible. The windows were frosted over, but David could just make out the shape of someone inside. David's heart raced as he cleared more snow, revealing the car's door. He yanked it open, the cold air rushing in. Inside was a woman, her face pale, her breathing shallow. She was unconscious, her body slumped against the seat. "Hey, can you hear me?" David said, shaking her gently. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. My son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. David's stomach dropped. He looked in the back seat and saw a child, no more than 5 years old, wrapped in a blanket. The boy was awake, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," David said, his voice calm despite the panic rising in his chest. "I'm going to get you out of here." David carried the boy to his car, the wolves watching silently. He returned for the woman, his muscles straining under her weight. As he laid her in the back seat, he noticed the wolves were still there, their eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. The alpha wolf let out a soft howl, the sound echoing through the night. Then, as if on cue, the pack turned and disappeared into the storm. David drove through the blizzard, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The woman, whose name was Claire, regained consciousness as they neared the town. She explained that she had lost control of her car during the storm and crashed into the snowdrift. She and her son Liam had been trapped for hours, their cries for help swallowed by the wind. When they reached the hospital, David stayed with Claire and Liam, his heart heavy with relief and gratitude. He couldn't stop thinking about the wolves, their strange behavior, their silent plea for help. The next day, David returned to the spot where he had found Claire and Liam. The snow had stopped, the world quiet and still. He searched the area, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the wolves. Then he saw it, a trail of paw prints leading into the forest. He followed the trail, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and fear. The trail led to a cave, its entrance partially hidden by snow. David hesitated, then stepped inside. The air was cold, the walls lined with ice, and there, in the center of the cave, was a wolf, the alpha. The wolf lay on the ground, its body still, its eyes closed. Around it were the other members of the pack, their heads bowed in silent mourning. David's breath caught in his throat. The alpha wolf was dead, its body riddled with wounds. But what struck him most was the look in the other wolves' eyes. Grief, loyalty, and a quiet acceptance. David buried the alpha wolf, his hands trembling as he dug the grave. He marked the spot with a simple stone, a silent tribute to the animal that had saved 2 lives. As he walked back to his car, he felt a sense of peace. The wolves had shown him something profound, a connection between humans and nature, a bond that went beyond words. David returned to his daily life, but the experience with the wolves lingered in his mind like a haunting melody. He found himself looking at the world differently, noticing the small details he had once overlooked. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves, the quiet beauty of the natural world. He shared his story with Sarah and Emily, their eyes wide with wonder as he described the wolves and their mysterious behavior. Emily, in particular, was fascinated. She begged David to take her to see the cave, to show her where the wolves had lived. "Not yet," David said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's not safe, especially in the winter, but maybe in the spring we can go together." Emily nodded, her disappointment tempered by the promise of future adventure. David couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Why had the wolves led him to Claire and Liam? What had happened to the alpha wolf? Determined to find answers, he began researching wolves and their behavior. He learned that wolves are highly social animals, with strong family bonds and a deep sense of loyalty. They are also incredibly intelligent, capable of complex communication and problem solving. But what intrigued David most was the idea that wolves could sense danger and respond to it in ways that humans couldn't fully understand. He reached out to a local wildlife biologist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had spent years studying wolves in the region. She agreed to meet with him, her curiosity piqued by his story. Dr. Vasquez listened intently as David recounted his experience, her eyes narrowing with interest. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Wolves are remarkable creatures," she said. "They have an almost uncanny ability to sense danger and respond to it. It's possible that the pack recognized the car as a threat, not to them, but to the people inside. They may have been trying to help." David nodded, his mind racing. But why would they do that? Why risk themselves for humans? Dr. Vasquez smiled. "Wolves are more complex than we give them credit for. They form bonds, not just with each other, but with their environment. It's possible that this pack had some kind of connection to the area, or even to the people who live there." David's research led him to an old legend, one that had been passed down through generations in the region. The story spoke of a wolf pack that had once saved a village from a deadly avalanche, their howls warning the villagers just in time. The legend resonated with David, filling in the gaps of his own experience. He began to see the wolves not as wild animals, but as guardians, protectors of the land and its people. Inspired by the legend, David decided to create a memorial for the alpha wolf. He gathered a group of volunteers, including Claire and Liam, and together they built a small stone cairn near the cave. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. David spoke about the wolf's bravery, its selflessness, and the bond it had shared with its pack. Claire and Liam placed a wreath of flowers at the base of the cairn, their eyes filled with gratitude. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, David felt a sense of closure. The wolves had given him a gift, a deeper understanding of the world and his place in it. David's life began to change in subtle but profound ways. He found himself more attuned to nature, more appreciative of the small moments that made life meaningful. He started spending more time outdoors, hiking with Sarah and Emily, teaching them about the plants and animals that shared their world. He also became an advocate for wildlife conservation, using his story to raise awareness about the importance of protecting wolves and their habitats. He worked with Dr. Vasquez to organize community events, educating people about the role wolves play in the ecosystem. Years passed, and the memorial became a symbol of hope and resilience for the community. People would visit the cairn, leaving flowers or small tokens of appreciation. The story of the wolves spread, inspiring others to see the natural world in a new light. David often returned to the cave, his heart filled with a quiet sense of peace. He would sit by the cairn, listening to the wind and the distant howl of wolves, and feel a connection to something greater than himself. One winter, as the first snow began to fall, David felt a strange pull toward the cave. He packed his bag, kissed Sarah and Emily goodbye, and set out on the familiar trail. When he reached the cave, he found a surprise waiting for him. A new pack of wolves, their eyes filled with the same quiet intensity he had seen all those years ago. The alpha wolf stepped forward, its gaze locking with David's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then with a soft whine, the wolf turned and disappeared into the forest, the pack following close behind. David sat by the cairn, his heart filled with a deep sense of gratitude. The wolves had come full circle, their legacy living on in the land and the people who called it home. As the snow began to fall, David closed his eyes and listened to the wind, its howl a reminder of the bond between humans and nature. David returned home, his heart light and his spirit renewed. He knew that the wolves would always be a part of him, their story woven into the fabric of his life. David's story began to ripple through the small mountain community. The tale of the wolves and their mysterious intervention spread like wildfire, shared over cups of steaming coffee in the local diner, and whispered in hushed tones at town meetings. People who had once feared the wolves now spoke of them with a newfound respect. Some recalled old stories of the land, remembering that long before the town was built, the wolves had roamed freely, their presence a natural part of the ecosystem. One evening, the town held a gathering at the community hall to discuss the wolves and their role in the mountains. The hall was packed. Farmers, hikers, business owners, and even skeptical hunters all came to listen. David was invited to speak, and as he stood before the crowd, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. He scanned the room, seeing familiar faces, people who had lived alongside the wolves for years, some who had lost livestock, others who had only ever seen them as shadows in the woods. "These wolves," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "they're not just animals. They're guardians. They've shown us that we're not separate from nature. We're a part of it. And if we can learn to live in harmony with them, we'll all be better for it." The room fell into a thoughtful silence. Some crossed their arms, still skeptical, but others nodded, their expressions softening. Then an older man named Joe, once one of the most outspoken critics of the wolves, stood up. He cleared his throat, glancing at the faces around him. "I never thought I'd say this," Joe admitted, "but maybe we got it wrong. Maybe it's time we start seeing them as more than just predators." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. The conversation shifted from fear to curiosity, and before the night was over, the town had taken its first step toward change. Inspired by David's speech, the community rallied together to create a conservation initiative aimed at protecting the local wolf population. It wasn't easy. Many still worried about livestock and hunting regulations. But a middle ground was found. They worked with Dr. Vasquez to establish a wildlife corridor, ensuring that the wolves had a safe passage through the mountains while keeping them away from farmlands. David became a key figure in the effort, using his story to rally support and raise funds. He organized hikes and educational workshops, showing people the intricate balance between predator and prey, the way wolves kept deer populations in check, preventing overgrazing that could harm the land. He spoke to children in schools, teaching them to see wolves not as villains in fairy tales, but as intelligent, social creatures vital to the ecosystem. One snowy afternoon, as he led a group of students through the woods, they stumbled upon a set of fresh paw prints, David knelt down, brushing the snow aside to reveal the deep, distinct imprint. "Look," he said, his voice filled with awe. "The wolves are still here." The children gathered around, eyes wide with wonder. In that moment, David knew that the future of the wolves was no longer just in his hands. It was in theirs too. As the conservation efforts took hold, the wolves began to return to the area. Sightings became more frequent, and the once feared predators were now celebrated as symbols of resilience and harmony. Wildlife photographers and researchers traveled to the mountains, eager to study the pack that had captured the hearts of the town. One crisp autumn evening, David found himself hiking toward the cave, drawn by an unspoken need to see the place where his journey had begun. The forest was alive with the rustling of leaves, the distant cry of an eagle, the scent of pine thick in the air. Then he saw them. A new pack stood in the clearing, their silver coats illuminated by the golden twilight. They were different from the wolves he had known, yet their presence carried the same quiet intensity. David's breath caught as the alpha stepped forward, its piercing amber eyes locking onto his. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. It was as if the wolf was acknowledging him, recognizing the bond that had formed between man and beast. Then with a soft whine, the wolf turned and disappeared into the forest, the pack following close behind. David exhaled, his chest tightening with emotion. The wolves had returned. The cycle had begun anew. Sitting beside the cairn, David let the weight of the moment settle over him. The past, the present, and the future all seemed to converge in this sacred place, where the wind carried stories and the land held memories like footprints in the snow. The wolves had come full circle, their legacy now woven into the land and the hearts of those who had once feared them. Farmers learned new ways to coexist, using guard dogs and better fencing, rather than resorting to old methods of hunting. The town, once divided on the issue, had found a way to embrace the wolves as part of their identity. The mountains had become home to both man and beast, not in opposition, but in balance. As the first snowflakes drifted down, David closed his eyes, listening to the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a howl rose into the night, a sound both mournful and triumphant, a voice echoing through time. David returned home, his spirit lighter, his purpose clearer. He knew now that his encounter with the wolves had never been about mere survival. It had been a lesson, a gift. The wolves had changed his life, and in return, he had helped change the lives of many others. Years passed and David continued his work, though he never stopped returning to the mountains. The cairn remained, a symbol of remembrance, respect, and gratitude. People visited it often, leaving flowers, notes, and small tokens in honor of the wolves who had given so much. One evening, as he stood on his porch, watching the moon rise over the snow-covered peaks, he felt it, that unbreakable bond. The wolves were still out there, running through the night, their spirits intertwined with his own. And as he gazed into the wild expanse of the mountains, he whispered a silent thank you to the creatures that had forever altered the course of his life.